Perfect. All right. Thank you, everybody, for your patience as we get going. For those of you that are
Several meeting rooms can be used for group meetings,
on the virtual
lectures,
platform, we're hoping
or
that that'll
project
eventually
discussions.
get sorted out. For those of you
Our
that are joining us on
faculty
YouTube,
teach a
everything
wide
looks good.
range of
All right.
courses in
So
visual critique,
welcome to today's
leading to
session of
excellent
visualization and
professor-student
practice.
ratio.
I'm
Some
really excited to bring
specialized
to you
courses
today
can even be
a bunch
taught
of
in
great
faculty
folks
offices.
talking about a variety of awesome things. This morning we had a session on the diversity of ideas. If you missed it, please check out the recording later on. So we now
Research
have
can
a
also
panel on
directly verify
visualization and
the subject
accessibility.
matter student. For
This is our
instance,
final virtual
for
panel of the day.
activity
In the
recognition.
afternoon, we are going to move on towards having two in-person panels. The first being Bridging Academia, Industry, and Government, and the second panel on Integrating Research and Products.
Or depth estimation.
So for questions today, there will be folks participating in a variety of forums, both online as well as in person. And we are going to try to moderate questions between the two different modes of attendance. So we do encourage everyone to please pose your questions through Slido, whether you're in person or online. It makes it easy for
One
us to
part of the
moderate and
VCC
curate the
is
questions,
dedicated to
as
the
well as give
educational
everybody
community,
an opportunity to
which
participate.
allows for
But
optimal
if you are in
settings
person,
and
we
the
are able to take
development of
questions from the
combined
room
optical and
using the
computational
room microphones,
interventions.
and we're going to try to moderate the number of questions that come from each place. So with that, I am delighted to kick off this panel on
VCC
visualization
facilitates a
and
direct
accessibility. We have
application
talks from
to
four great
facilitate
speakers.
of
If
the
you're new to Viz in
visualization
Practice,
work.
the way this will work is that the speakers will each give about a
For
10-minute
example,
presentation of
the
their work,
next case,
and then we're going to dive into questions in sort of a free-form fishbowl style panel where we're taking questions from the
analyze this
audience
playbook
on what you
shown
just
here.
saw and any burning questions you have on visualization and accessibility in practice. I encourage you to ask your questions on Slido, while people are talking. You don't need to wait until the end, and we'll curate and pose those questions as they come up. So with that, I am going to turn it
I'd
over
like to
to
highlight the
the
VCC
first
site
participant
account
of
member
the day.
SiliconViz that
Um,
took the drone footage
gosh,
for this video.
and of course my stuff got all messed up.
This concludes our
So just
presentation
give me one
of the
second.
VCC. Our members thank you for stopping by and visiting with
All
us.
right, so I am
We hope
delighted
to
to welcome
welcome you in
Frank
person
as
in the
our
future.
first participant. Go. All right. True. Great. So Frank Olewski is a design engineer turned researcher who is currently pursuing a PhD at the intersection of data interaction and accessibility at Carnegie Mellon University's Human-Computer Interaction Institute. He is also the author of Chartability, a set of heuristics for evaluating the accessibility of data experiences. Before pursuing his PhD, Frank was a lead contributor to Visa Chart Components, a design system component library of charts and graphs built with a focus on accessibility. Thank you so much, Frank, and please take it away.
Thanks. Super happy to be here. Obviously, I love the Viz community in general. It's fun to be on a panel, especially one for, that's sort of, there's a focus on practitioners here. So this is a treat. Also, super glad that Jamie's here. Jamie and I used to work together at Visa, so I love that we get to be on a panel together. If we get into trouble, don't call our boss. So yeah, I talk about data visualization and accessibility a lot, and actually, to the visualization folks, I really like to say that I do data interaction, and I think that's maybe a more appropriate way to sort of frame what I do. I work at Carnegie Mellon. I'm a PhD student, research assistant. I'm in the Axel lab with Patrick Carrington. That's an accessibility focused lab. And then DIG with Dominic Moritz. Hey, Dom, if you're out there watching this. Yeah, I do some researchy stuff at Apple right now. I collaborate with industry partners actually a lot. And I also contribute to standards. I will occasionally make an appearance at the ARIA working group and contributing to ARIA in whatever way I can. And I sort of do a bunch of other stuff as well. So yeah, I liked it. So I made a jump from being a practitioner into, I got to start my timer. Hold on. Got to stay on track. I'm going to set it to 9 minutes now. Hopefully I'm sort of close. Okay. Yeah, I like to frame my research actually as part of like my journey from being a practitioner into research. It's an odd jump, especially if you are just talking, salary. It's a very odd jump. But the way that I frame it is actually that creators use tools to make things. And I like this little kind of framework for just sort of introducing where I come in to the picture. And obviously, as time goes on, we get more and more things, right? So this sort of little framework is a way to actually talk about how different people approach accessibility work. And if I was in person, I would ask the audience, how much of this do you think is inaccessible? And I'd like gather a couple, guesses from the audience. If you're, in some kind of chat format somewhere, you can like type in a percentage that you think. What percentage of current things do you reckon are inaccessible? And, wait a couple seconds. So it turns out basically all of it, almost everything we make is inaccessible in some way, shape, or form by some measurement. Not great. So what are we going to do about this? As we go into the future, the rate of inaccessibility really has not changed by every measurement we've made over the last few years, but the volume continues to increase. We're making more and more things, more content, more data content, more charts, more graphs. The future doesn't look good. This is a bad trajectory. And so I come in with this into research with sort of a sense of urgency. I want to reduce this scale. It's really it's hostile infrastructure that we've placed for people with disabilities to navigate information in the world around us. Researchers, I like to say, most often, especially in an HCI kind of sense, dream of ideals, and practitioners do this too. We look at what's the best user experience, and we sort of figure out from people with disabilities what the best experience for them might be. We'll publish papers on like disability experiences and things like that, and also just doing UX research in industry. There's also this other thing we can do is we can intervene on the things we've already made. An auditor comes in and says, oh, these are like 50 things you did wrong. You should fix these things. I'm an expert in this area. We bring in people with disabilities to audit. We also may have machine learning algorithms or just machines in general automate something that we're pretty confident about. Research, I think, loves this space as well. So then there's this other thing we can do is we can change kind of the system laws and environments that motivate creators, right? And I would say historically, this is where we see humongous impact. And I don't do any of that stuff that I just said. So that's like kind of framing some really awesome stuff that other people do that I don't do. I actually do this weird little thing right here. I work in this space of tools, and I work to give creators better tools. And I'm pretty broad with my definition of tools. Pretty much that little dotted line there is like the line between creation and the thing created. And so I'm interested in catching things before they're made. So catching inaccessibility before it's made. Can we have smarter systems? Can we have smarter tools that kind of make better data visualizations in general? And an example of this was actually Visa chart components. So this is a design system library. This is what we built. Jamie and I built this, of course, with the team. And we created components that developers use to really make really custom data visualizations, and pretty cool stuff, honestly. But a lot of our work was actually ensuring that there's a lot of accessibility out of the box ready to go, and also that the charts themselves are somewhat smart in a pretty deterministic way, I guess, but somewhat smart about saying, hey, these are some things you should probably do before you ship this thing to make it more accessible. And so my background has always been in tooling. And again, just to frame that the inaccessibility scale is bad, but over a quarter of all people living in the United States self-report living with a disability. So it's significant when we start thinking about accessibility to not just think, there's this assumption in visualization, we're just talking about vision related or visual related disabilities, but color vision deficiency is the most common thing I think people first figure out they need to consider, and then blindness, low vision, but actually cognitive and neurological disabilities are significantly impact the work we do here. Motor and dexterity and vestibular and motion related disabilities are all actually pretty significant for people interacting with data visualizations. And it's important that we consider all of this stuff. So I'm going to briefly go through an example of chartability, which is my latest project. I've done almost 100,000 tests now, uh, just auditing visualizations for accessibility. And any given visualization, which is a pretty broad definition, but any given visualization averages like just over 300 accessibility errors. And I think just sort of to frame what that means when you do auditing work is, we'll just start with this from CNN. This is from the US 2020 presidential elections. This is their map. It also has like a bar chart kind of between Biden and Trump. And this was live updating during the election. So if I were to come in and evaluate this with chartability, and keep in mind, this is going to be really broad strokes here. The first thing we check for are perceivable failures. So perceivable means that people perceive things in different ways. Some people have low vision, some people are blind, some people have color vision deficiency. We kind of need to make sure content's available for everybody. And there are low contrast errors here. Actually, that red used for Trump, when it's used for text, is a contrast failure. So we can actually have like, there are pretty simple models that just can evaluate these things automatically. You can also use like a dropper, like a little color dropper tool, extract the color, put it into like tools online. And this says, it's a failure. The contrast ratio is 3.44 to 1. It should be 4.5 to 1. So it's too low. So that red needs to be a little darker, at least when it's used for text. It's actually okay on the geometries. Contents only visual. So this is, I went through with a screen reader, actually multiple screen readers on this. And I love that the states can be navigated if you kind of hack it a little bit. But really, when you get to the map itself, the screen reader just reads out the word image, and screen readers actually should have all the necessary contextual information available. So we should know what state is blue. So like Washington should at least say Washington, and then it should say Biden. So lots of failures there. And another pillar of accessibility is operability. So interaction modalities need to have multiple input types. So what this means is like anything a mouse can do, you at least need to let a keyboard do. Keyboards are like this amazing interface, software API, the keyboard API, that like almost every major serial like accessibility device uses. So switches, keyboards, and screen readers all generally use keyboards to navigate. And if you do something with a mouse, like if you can hover and get tooltips, you can click things and go somewhere, keyboards also need to be able to do that stuff. So everything here fails as well. And data visualization, I always throw this one in because it's extra spicy, is you can't have anything too small. So if you do have like an expected hover interaction, you need a minimum size. So maps are always tricky with this because states get small. Anyway, so if we fast forward and we kind of do everything in chartability, which is 50 total tests across a bunch of different pillars, we end up with almost 1,000 accessibility failures. I did this one in about an hour. That's my alarm. Okay. And I just want to say that doing this work is hard. And I think we can get better at doing this work. So my main conjecture is that we can't build a more accessible world if we don't know how to recognize accessibility barriers. And then the second thing is that most practitioners don't know how to do this work. So we need to assist them in it. And how can tools, I'll fast forward to the end, sorry. This is from a longer talk, so I got the main stuff done. How do tools shape how practitioners imagine the potential of their work? And can tools supplement and augment practitioner intelligence when doing something like accessibility, which is really difficult and requires a lot of knowledge? Yeah, so that's what I do now. Thanks.
Thank you, Frank. That was great. For folks that are just joining us, we are taking questions after all of the panelists have an opportunity to present. We encourage everybody to ask their questions on Slido through the virtual platform, and the view of that platform, the stream for that platform has now been fixed. And if you're in the room in Oklahoma City, we'll also be taking questions at the end from the mics, but we still encourage you to use the Slido platform if you can. So with that, I am really excited to introduce the next speaker. This is Jamie Tanner. Jamie is a designer and developer focused on making accessible charts, maps, and data graphics. She has a Master's of Science in Data Visualization from the Parsons School of Design and has spent the last few years working at Visa as a part of the Visa Chart Components core team. She recently joined the New York Times as an accessibility editor. Jamie is just going to be talking to us about her work today. Please go ahead and take it away, Jamie.
Yay, awesome. Thank you so much. I don't have slides. I just kind of planned to maybe chat through how I got here. I thought maybe that would be interesting and we can kind of dive into stuff after, so you can stare at my face through my terrible laptop camera. Apologies. But I'm happy to be here. I've been working in the data viz space for many years now, and I've never attended Viz, so it's exciting to be here and get a chance to learn from some folks and, hopefully share back what I can. It's interesting to hear Frank say that he kind of started as a practitioner and made his way to the research space. I'm very much kind of the opposite. I started working in a research space and I'm now very much a practitioner. In my undergraduate, I studied psychology and general science and really fell in love with research at that time. And I worked in as many different labs as I could at that time, kind of trying to figure out what it was that I was most interested in and drawn to. I did tons of fun, weird things, banding birds and genotyping, Pika, et cetera, et cetera. But after I graduated, I found a job as a lab technician at a neuroscience research lab, studying neural epigenetics. So looking at, modifying gene expression and looking at how that could promote protection and repair of the central nervous system. And I worked in that for a few years, but at some point started to realize, maybe the rose-colored glasses kind of fell off. I started to see some of the realities and challenges of working in academia and research that I didn't love. And I started to think about how I could transition out of this work. I wasn't necessarily sure how to do that. I had a bunch of, lab skills that were very useful and valuable to me when I was working in research and didn't really translate to other jobs very well. And I also wasn't necessarily sure what to do. But somehow, some way, it kind of occurred to me as I was doing some kind of analysis someday, and I was trying to figure out how to visualize something. I was looking up data visualization, and I just, it occurred to me that this was kind of its own field that I could work in, and this kind of congealed to me as a space that was really interesting and fun. And so, yeah, that was really exciting. I just, I also had no idea how to kind of get into this space. I was doing some work on the side to, teach myself how to code. My partner was a designer, and it wasn't lost on me how challenging that work could be as well. But, magically, or very fortunate for me at the time, Parsons School of Design in New York was just starting up this new master's program in data visualization, which probably speaks to how big data viz was at the time. This is probably around 2014. So I applied, to my surprise, got in. It was really exciting. It's challenging, but a great kind of career decision. Really love working in this space, and I learned a ton. I learned, how to write code, how to make lots of charts and graphics and P5 and D3, and work with different databases. And I learned design from a lot of folks. I'm still learning design. That was probably the hardest piece of it, but it was a lot in 10 months. But what I didn't learn a lot about was accessibility. I think, somewhat ironically, I think I often heard folks describe the work that we were doing as making data more accessible to people because it wasn't very accessible in a table and it was easier to understand visually. And I think, looking back now, I have a better understanding, or I see how wrong or at least incomplete that idea was, that often when we were creating these very visual and interactive data explorations, we were often making things that couldn't be experienced by a lot of disabled folks. And I think even though we did spend some time thinking about different ways of understanding data in different modalities, data sonification, sound and kinesthetic ways of understanding data, it certainly wasn't, or at least I don't think that there was enough time spent discussing, who we were excluding when we were just making exclusively visual work or exclusively work that could be, I don't know, interacted with a mouse, for example. Not enough time spent thinking about how to make that work more equitable or making truly accessible Viz, which is a shame because I think I was kind of the unique case that got into this work kind of in a formal, traditional way. I went to school and studied it and got a degree. And so, my hope is that that'll change in the future. But after graduating, I worked at a few jobs, one of them probably the longest, working at a nonprofit on a research team again, helping to kind of create data visualizations in Illustrator for different printed reports. And I'd really wanted to do more programming and development work. And at some point, I'd stumbled upon this job at Visa for a new data viz team that they were building. And two things that were really exciting to me about that role. One was that the person running the team, Krista Martini, seemed excited to have generalists on the team, which I think was cool. Before that, you're either a designer and a developer or a developer in a lot of roles I saw, but he kind of saw the value in being a little bit of everything, which I thought was cool. But two, they were also pretty explicit in the role that they wanted somebody to join who would be thinking about how to make data viz more accessible. And I'd really never seen that in a job posting before. So that was pretty exciting. So I, took the plunge, moved to California for that role. I'd really only worked in a research setting before that, so I didn't know what to expect at all. But, it was an amazing experience. I started the same week as Frank, so we really were on the journey together. Lots of amazing folks on the team, including Tika Lin, who I think is also here today, who, had started some of that work that we ended up building on as we were working on Visa chart components, which Frank went over a little bit. A design systems library of chart components. And, a big part of the goal there was to make that library as accessible as possible so that when Visa was creating products, they could pull in that library and have a more accessible product. And, we did as much as we could to kind of build in accessibility into that library as well. I think at that time, I learned so much about accessibility. It, I think, really shifted what I thought good data viz design was, what we're responsible for as data viz designers and developers. So it's, meaningful to me in a lot of ways and really shifted how I think about the work that we do. It was, delightful time to work with so many folks. I in that role as well, I think I just also learned about, the standards that existed for a long time. Frank, really led so much of that accessibility work. And I remember very well, Frank, when you came back from a first meeting with our kind of internal accessibility team at Visa, we had a Visa global accessibility requirements, as I think a lot of companies do. But yeah, I remember you coming back with a kind of this long list of accessibility requirements that we had at Visa. And I think, it kind of formalizing for me for the first time that Viz wasn't special in some way, that we should also think about, how the Vizes that we create kind of adhere to these accessibility requirements. And thinking for the first time, okay, reading things like, color alone shouldn't be used to communicate something. And obviously that's an encoding that we use all the time when we're doing data viz work. So what does that really mean when we have to, think about creating a library or a way of building charts that doesn't only include color to communicate certain things, for example. So yeah, tons of fun designing and thinking about how to make data more accessible, but also I think something we talked a lot about that time was just making an experience that was really delightful for people. And I think that's something that I carry with me as well. And yeah, it was just a really supportive place. I remember, I was thinking also as I was thinking about this talk, one of the last charts that we added to the library was an alluvial diagram that I was working on, just like a Sankey. And I remember very well kind of coming up with, I think 15 different ways I could imagine somebody, a keyboard navigation pattern somebody could have there, and chatting with Frank and kind of summarizing that into 3 main ones. And, I just think it was awesome to have a team that was kind of supportive of us, not just doing the bare minimum there, but really thinking about what a good experience could be in all of these different scenarios. So that was awesome. Spent 4 years there, and a lot of that work is open source now, and y'all could see that. I think there's lots of amazing things in there, but lots of stuff that I think folks will hopefully build off of as well. And I recently left Visa at the end of the summer to join the New York Times as their first accessibility visuals editor. The goal of that role is to make their interactive and visual journalism more accessible and more engaging to folks with disabilities. So it's I'm really excited about the role. It's a new role for me. I'm very new in the role, but yeah, lots new for me there. It's definitely the first time I'm kind of in a more accessibility focused role. But the work environment, again, totally different, new change. And I think, even though I know a lot more about accessibility in the data viz space now, I think, the way that we get there at the New York Times is probably a lot different than how we did it at Visa. And I'm kind of excited to see where we'll go there. And I think, a lot I could see at the New York Times kind of reflects my own kind of data viz practice. Like it's not necessarily always, I don't always have this like very controlled, centralized library of chart components. Sometimes I'm making something kind of hacky in D3 and throwing it into Illustrator. And, how do I think about making those experiences more accessible too? I think that'll be interesting and fun work. So yeah, I'm really excited for what's to come. I'm excited for this step towards visual journalism that's more accessible, and I'm excited for more folks to be able to enjoy that reporting. And I've also, for a long time looked to the New York Times as kind of the standard. They've definitely influenced my work as a data viz practitioner, and I'm so excited to be able to kind of see more examples of what great alt text looks like in a kind of funky, unusual graphic I'm looking at. Yeah, I'm excited to just have more examples of what good work looks like in this space too. Yeah, so lots to come there. Lots of fun stuff to come there, I hope. But yeah, that's it from me. Excited to chat with everyone, to answer some questions where I can.
Thank you so much, Jamie, for that introduction. Like really wide-ranging, really super cool experiences from coming from the research community towards a practitioner space, towards accessibility. I hope for grad students in the audience, they'll ask you some questions about that journey as well, and sort of the different points of inflection that you had on that way. So like once again, for the folks that are joining us, we're taking all the questions at the end once the panelists have an opportunity to present their work. Once again, I encourage you to pose your questions on Slido, and we'll also be able to take questions in person. So I am really excited to introduce our next speaker, Kai Cheng. Kai is a UX engineer at Google, focusing on data visualization tools and data accessibility. Previously, he is a design technologist at Stamen Design. He contributes to open source efforts and experiments around data viz, and you can see a bunch of examples on his personal website. So take it away, Kai.
Thank you, Anna. And yeah, it's great to be here at Viz with Frank, Jamie, and Jen. As Anna mentioned, yes, I was come from sort of the open source community. I consider it sort of a community of, in many cases, sort of amateurs. We taught ourselves how to do visualization. And it's sort of, in my opinion, still sort of a nascent field, even though it's been around for a while. It's very experimental, and people come from all different backgrounds. Now I work as a UX engineer in data visualization at Google. I sort of consider engineer to be a misnomer too. I still feel like I come from that community of amateurs and still sort of figuring it out. I don't think that data viz is a totally sort of established. The best practices are, it's sometimes a judgment call, in my opinion. I was previously a design technologist at Stamen, and at Stamen Design, I got to do a lot of experimental work, and that was just a delight. If you go to my homepage, you can see a lot of that ended up sort of more open source, and I have some open source D3 examples there as well. Did want to talk a little bit about where I currently work at Google. Google's core mission is to make the world's information universally accessible and useful. And at any company, they have a sort of different perspective and way of going about it. I started on a data visualization team. When I was interviewing at Google, I was interviewing with Manuel Lima, who was running this team. And he asked me if I had done any visualization with researchers. And I went for about 10 minutes talking about some of the work I'd done with Stamen, with some researchers at UC Berkeley. And at some point, 5 minutes in, he had a weird face. He stopped me. He was like, wait, I mean, these are UX researchers? And I was like, no, I thought you meant scientific researchers. And it's just, yeah, Google frequently, when people say researchers, they mean they're not talking about science, they're talking about UX researchers studying user behavior. And accessibility too, is sort of filters into the way Google is organized. They have sort of particular, their own set of standards for what accessibility means. And there are teams of designers, researchers, product managers that organize their work around these ideas of accessibility. And recently I moved to an inclusive design team, which has a focus on data accessibility. So now for me, I'm also trying to pick it up, just learn more about the details of what we need to comply with for screen readers, keyboard navigation, and color contrast standards, things like that, and visualization experiences. Most of my work at Google ends up internal, sort of in Google's parallel universe of internal tools. They're for every very popular sort of external tool, there's very frequently an internal version that teams at Google use, and it's not so easy to open source a lot of that work. Some of the things I've worked on that have made it out are Dan LaLiberte created a Vega chart wrapper for Google Charts. At Google, we have a lot of legacy technologies. Google Charts is one of those that is essentially unmaintained, but it's still out there. And it was built over 10 years ago. And when the team built it, they did have a consideration for accessibility at the time, fairly early. It has sort of a table-based accessibility solution for most of the visualizations. But it doesn't continue to evolve. And so we're really looking for open source technologies like Vega as a way for teams to sort of be using more modern visualization types and practices. And this is a recurring problem at big companies like Google. You have these legacy tools, and a lot of times accessibility is just this process of remediating sort of existing experiences and work. With Kent Eisenhuth, and especially on the DataViz team, we did get to do sort of this more kind of forward-looking exploratory approaches on what accessibility could look like if we were considering it first and building new experiences. And we were able to write an article for Smashing Magazine that describes that. And as part of that, I made internally a bunch of color studies. One of the requirements that is always sort of tricky are the color contrast requirements for what is accessible text and what are accessible marks in a graph or figure. Frequently, these need to be sort of a 3:1 or 4.5:1 contrast ratio. Frequently, this means that for instance, there are these color palettes that Cynthia Brewer created, the Color Brewer palettes that are now the sort of default palettes in many open source charting packages. Almost all of the sequential palettes, many of the categorical palettes have sort of lower contrast colors as part of the palette. And the way most DataViz components or charts work is that they'll just take those colors and color the mark that one color. And so if that particular color is not high contrast enough, it's not a usable palette for us. So it rules out most of the sort of open source palettes that sort of perceptual researchers have created to be good or useful DataViz palettes. And I'm always interested in ways we can work around these constraints, the constraints that marks need to have these contrast ratios. One solution is you add an extra detail. You stroke the mark so that it has higher contrast on its edge. And you can stroke it gray or you can stroke it black. If you stroke it black, it means that every mark in your visualization has now the same stroke, so it's not a sort of quantitative or qualitative encoding. They're all just stroked black. You can stroke it with a darker color that is the same color or similar color as the fill color, but most DataViz tools don't make it that easy to specify a different color for the fill and stroke of their marks. Yeah, this is the kind of stuff that bothers me every day, is these different trade-offs between what sort of these legacy tools are capable of building, and yeah, what accessibility requirements we want to meet, and what people building visualizations want the visualization to look like. It's not always exactly for the open source community. I feel like it's a lot about people expressing an idea that they have. At Google, it's trying to, in general, it's trying to just clearly convey some information, and it's still useful to have a variety of palettes to choose from. Yeah, so that's sort of this is what I do day to day now, and yeah, I'll stop it there. I don't have a solution for you in this slide deck. I just have a problem.
It's always great to start with problems. A lot more fun to start with problems, certainly. So thank you, Kai, for that great chat. So once again, as our last speaker wraps up, encourage folks to use the Slido platform to ask their questions. I'll also ask for your patience and maybe going a couple minutes over time since we started a little bit late due to some technical challenges. But the last speaker that I'm delighted to introduce is Dr. Jennifer Mankoff. So Jen Mankoff is a Richard E. Lander Professor in the Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of Washington. Her research is focused on accessibility through giving people the voice, tools, and agency to advocate for themselves. She strives to bring both structural and personal perspectives to her work. For example, her recent work in fabrication of accessible technologies considers not only innovative tools that could enable individual makers, but also the larger clinical and sociological challenges to disseminating and sharing designs. Similarly, her work in the intersection of mental health and discrimination uses sensed data to explore how external risks and pressures interact with people's responses to challenging moments. So with that, please take it away, Jen.
Thank you so much for that introduction. Today, what I want to talk about is in the intersection of what we visualize and why we visualize. And I'm just going to start with this little example here of a sonification that is attached to a microbit. And here it's a proximity sensor that's being sonified. And this is from a paper that's going to be presented later this fall at WIST that was first authored by my PhD student, Venkatesh Patluri. And what I want to sort of highlight about this example is that what you just saw was a visualization, but it was also part of an interactive experience for somebody who was using data to understand a program they were creating. And it raises this question of what it is that we want to enable when we make visualizations accessible. And I would argue that one of the things we should be enabling is for people to make their own data visualizations, including people who are blind and low vision, which or visually impaired, which I'm summarizing here using the acronym BVI. And so in the toolkit that we're presenting at WIST, what we allow people to do is to hook streaming data from sensors up to a tool that lets them decide how to handle that data and how to output it. And what this really is about is asking the question of, can blind and low vision people create new information? Are they included in the employment opportunities and learnings associated with all of data science? Can they access information when somebody didn't already decide it needs to be accessible? And how can we support individualized needs like live data exploration or creating maps that might be specific to one very particular context that we couldn't have prepared for? So here's an example of how we might do that. Using optimization tools, we can automatically create an interface using a tool called Optimum that Megan Hoffman created, who's now at Northeastern, former student of mine. And we can let each user specify their personal information priorities and preferred representations, and then output maps that have those things represented. And this is a 3D printed map that's shown on the screen here. That is designed to help somebody more successfully and efficiently, and we showed this in a user study, identify locations of interest in unknown areas. In a recent survey of accessible visualization papers published between 1999 and 2020 by Kim et al., only 2 papers supported interactive authoring of charts by BVI users. And so we have to ask the question, are we creating equivalent experiences? Are we conveying the same information to people who are blind and low vision or otherwise disabled? And are we also creating the same interactive experiences? And I should also add here the same authoring experiences. And I'm going to claim that this concept of authoring isn't really just for high-end data scientists, but in some sense, because when we use visualizations, we are constructing visual queries as sighted people, for example, looking at those visualizations. And then when we now add in interactive charts that afford things like selection, filtering, and more, if we're going to support full access to these from people with a range of disabilities, that act of authoring a visual query is a kind of authoring, and we need to think about authoring as part of what we support in Access. I just want to give one example that's not from my group, VoxLens, because I just think it's such a great paper. And this was one of the things I supported in VoxLens. So VoxLens was a tool that you could add a very short amount of JavaScript to any web page that had a variety of different visualization platforms represented on it. And then they would use that JavaScript to pull in code that could make that visualization more accessible. This was done by Sharif et al. And they were able to improve the accuracy of the information extracted by blind and low vision people by 122% using this tool. But I just want to highlight here that one of the things they did was they allowed people to ask questions, to author queries, and have those questions be answered, such as what is the maximum data point in the graph, or what about average and variance? Now, the toolkit that we're publishing at WIS this year also allows authoring. And it allows it through a GUI, which you're seeing here. I'm not going to show the video in the interest of time. But this allows users to select, parameterize, and attach various kinds of outputs to streaming data. And in our study of this tool, people really felt like it let them understand, create sonifications themselves, and add and remove multiple ones and tweak their parameters. And this allowed interacting with visualizations. Now, one of the things I want to highlight here is that, just to briefly touch on, is that we don't just want to think about sonification here. We want to think about the full range of different kinds of tasks that people might have when interacting with data, from data collection through cleaning, modeling, and representation. And in my group, because we do a lot of fabrication, we also think about data physicalization. So the same toolkit that supported that sonification can also support the creation of a laser cuttable diagram of notes for a music box, just as a fun example that we implemented. And again, I think in the interest of time, I won't play this video. Oops, I did by mistake. I'm trying to get to the next slide. Here we go. And I just want to end by just saying that there's a lot of room for, I think, really interesting access tools that use tactile graphics. And we can create 3D shapes. We can create 2D shapes. This is another piece of ongoing work in the group. And we can really think about how that fits into this whole life cycle. So I am going to actually stop here just because I know I've been talking for close to 10 minutes and we also are a little behind. But yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Jen. All right, we are now into the sort of question portion of our panel today. So once again, I'm encouraging you to ask your questions on Slido or ask your questions in person in the mic in the room. We don't have online, we don't have visibility in the room. So I'm going to start with an online question. And if there are people making their way to their mics, I'll turn it over after that. So you folks in the room can feel free to ask questions as well. So we have a few questions that have come in on Slido that I'm going to pose to all of the participants. The first one is from an anonymous source. How long does it take to do an accessibility test on a single chart? And is there a way to evaluate the accessibility of many visualizations at scale, say about 100 visualizations? So I might pose that question to Frank first, since he is the one who's talked about how many he has evaluated recently, and then I'd like to open it up to the rest of the panelists also to share their experiences as well.
Yeah, great question. I think the word test is the important question, or the important term here. I think I want to at least like kind of shape a little bit. Testing is always in the accessibility space, almost always in terms of some existing standard or guideline. And so when we say test, it's not always the same as how a researcher might evaluate something. So evaluatory methods and testing methods are actually kind of different. So like in accessibility standards, like WCAG, which is Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, there's 78 things you need to check. And each of them have different techniques and methods. Some of them have automated tools and some don't. And in like evaluatory methods in research, you might bring in people with disabilities, have them interact with a prototype. And then for their specific disabilities, they may give you feedback. That's like a long, like much longer process for testing. So in chartability, which I made specifically for testing in an accessibility standards kind of way, it's a toolkit for data visualizations. It takes me about an hour for like a single chart, and I'm pretty fast. And when we had participants, it takes them about 2 to 8 hours per chart. And across all of the heuristics and everything you should test for, it's pretty much impossible to automate some of them because there's so much contextualized information that goes into the design and creation of a data viz that you might not be able to scale some of it. DQ, which is basically the #1 company out there that does automated accessibility testing, says that coverage for automated tests is about 60%, and that probably won't change. So there's about 40% of things you're just going to have to do manually. It's not going to scale. Yeah.
But I wonder, can I jump in and like ask?
Yeah.
How much have you, Frank, I don't know, retested, or maybe you're working on something and you're kind of improving it? I don't know. Has there been cases where you like go back to something that, you know, you maybe did an audit on and retested it? Does that, I don't know, how, you know, over time, as you're kind of like testing the same thing, does that like decrease how much time you spend kind of testing something, or do you kind of just...
Oh, good question. Okay, so the best way to reduce time, this was my real pitch, my secret pitch, not in the paper. My secret pitch about chartability was, if you practice this stuff, you just do it while you work as a creator, right? Because my goal is empowering creators. I don't really want, I mean, no offense to the accessibility auditors out there, but I wasn't making a tool for them. I was making a tool so that people who make charts can kind of like evaluate their own work as they go. And the overhead is like very little. You kind of like occasionally use a screen reader just to double check something. You bring in an extra library when you're making your charts to kind of do some automated stuff. So yeah, and when it comes to rechecking, yeah, it gets way faster, because yeah.
Yeah, that's something I'm definitely thinking a lot about myself now, as I'm thinking about, you know, in journalism, you have this role of an editor, and that's kind of an interesting role that I really hadn't thought about. You know, when we were at Visa, it's somebody who kind of takes a look at your work, maybe addresses certain things, or, you know, focuses on certain things depending on the stage of the story. But yeah, I keep thinking about what that means for accessibility. Is it necessarily doing a full audit as you would think about it every single time you put something together? Maybe it's something where, you know, as I'm sure, you know, many of us doing this work know, you do kind of like build this kind of instinct, or you start to know things to look out for, and you kind of, you know, maybe can right away pull the 5 kind of typical issues that you typically see when you look at something really quickly. But yeah, definitely starting to think about that myself, like a quick kind of way to do this work and to build that process out that, I don't know, could be, you could build on over time. You know, there's some places where you might know you're usually typically okay in this area, but this area is usually something that's a little more challenging, and you need to take a little more time to test every time and make sure it's in place. Yeah, anyway, more, as Kai said, more questions than answers there, but
Jen and Kai, do you have anything that you'd like to add just around, you know, testing accessibility at scale?
Sorry, I do want to add one thing, which is hire people with disabilities who know what they're doing, and get them engaged in it.
And for researchers, that might mean bringing them into your lab too.
Kai, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to echo that point. Yeah, just because it passes, an accessibility test you have set up, does not mean that it's going to be accessible for all users. So, yeah, in general, yeah, the tools will be, you know, designed to pass those tests, but it still doesn't mean that work is accessible. So.
Yeah, I
A
have
lot
this
of
very grim. Oh, I have this very grim thing that I talk about all the time. So that slide where I said, oh, like 97 to 99.9% of things are inaccessible, that's according to standards. And there's been a lot of research that shows that standards aren't even good enough. So it's like, oh, if we do the bare minimum, that still doesn't mean the work is over. Yeah.
a lot of thoughts from those great responses that you guys gave. There's some more questions coming up. I picked Chris, and he's told me for the moment that there aren't people physically at the mics. We have more questions on Slido, so if you're in the room and asking questions on Slido, thank you very much. So another question that has come up is many organizations have branding requirements that restrict color palettes. This further compounds the accessibility challenges of picking colors for visualizations. Are there any strategies or tools that can help? So we'll start with Kai, since you brought up the issue, and also I'm pretty sure Google has a bunch of branding it tries to put out there. So I'd like to start with you for answering that question.
Yeah, Google has a lot of branding, and we have a lot of there is a hierarchy of style guides at Google. If you work in a particular product area, there may be several different style guides that you could work from. And sometimes, especially for the DataVis color palettes, they're not the most extensive choices. So you may be constrained in your choices to a very limited number of high contrast colors that were picked that were deemed accessible. And they may not work perfectly for your use case. So you end up in the situation where that I find where teams are looking for colors that the style guide doesn't have. And I enjoy kind of being sort of an agonist to the design system, sort of challenging the design system and pushing it. I think there's always going to be deficiencies in design systems. They can always be improved. In terms of particular strategies or tools, I really look to, there are several people in the space. Frank is one of them. Lisa Charlotte Muth, Paul Toll. There are several others that have written these wonderful tutorials and strategies and have created tools to selecting colors. And I would just check that out. Try to tune in with the with where the sort of open source community is currently. I think there's some great thinkers in this space. And yeah, I love that work is being done in the open.
Frank, as well as Jamie, do you have any thoughts to chime in? Both working, previously at Visa, as well as the now New York Times, that also has a lot of branding and tries to promote that along with accessibility.
Yeah, I'd say generally, I don't know. I always think that like brand colors do a certain job, and that job is slightly different than the role of color in a lot of data viz work. And so I'm usually, maybe Kai, it sounds like you're doing something similar, but I'm usually pushing against just sticking to brand colors anyway to do this job. It doesn't, they weren't built for this job necessarily. Sometimes you're looking at continuous diverging color palettes that you need. And so I think generally my move has just been to argue the case that you do kind of want a separate, more deliberate color palette for the work that you're doing. I know that's a battle that you might not always win, but it's something that I've always fought for and worked for. And, I think I've seen there's value, especially when you start to think about the accessibility of those colors as well. I think that's, an even stronger argument for being really deliberate and considerate about the colors that you're using. So yeah, that's probably what I'd argue for.
Yeah, I think the only thing I would say on top of all of this is color is often in the design space, especially when you're at a big company and there's an existing set of design guidelines or a design system. It's a negotiation, I think. And when you're in that space of negotiation, it is actually very hard. There's a role that accessibility focused practitioners end up playing, which is you're trying to advocate for people with disabilities. And your argument is often in terms of this isn't standard. Can we compromise? Can we do something here? Can we do something else? And actually, like, to stress that involving people with disabilities in the workplace, one of the things that I actually want to just kind of go back to and caution is that we don't hire people with disabilities just to be those advocates for themselves, because actually that's like a huge track to burnout. But really, I think what we need are better systems for like producing more accessible things. Accessibility standards are actually a risk mitigation practice for most companies. You follow standards so you don't get sued. And really, the goal should be to make something really excellent or delightful. And one of the ways you do that is you involve people, either as a panel or as people giving feedback in the production of your design guidelines and your branding. And I would love something radical like that. I mean, it seems radical because I really just don't think anybody does that, but I would love that to be something that we do in the future down the road.
That's really thoughtful. Very much hear the burnout argument as well. Jen, do you have any thoughts on this topic? Okay. So we'll move on to the next question that's come up. Another participant indicated they came across some chart component libraries today, and they include common chart types, but oftentimes there are use cases where people need to build custom charts using real-time data. What are some of the steps to make custom visualizations more accessible? And here I'd be really curious to start with Jen's take, especially as she's presented us with a lot of really interesting ways of alternative presentations to data through physicalization, through sonification. To maybe kick it off with, how do we deal with the situation of custom charts and real-time data when things are in flux?
I mean, I think a big piece of what we need is better tools, right? So I don't think we're at the point yet where the tools that we have are fully capable of easily creating custom and accessible visualizations. You can certainly do a lot of work to get there. But if we start to build accessibility into the tools that we use to create visualizations, just as we build it into the processes that Frank was just talking about, it will be so much easier to create delightful things. And frankly, accessibility is justifiable entirely on the basis of its value to people with disabilities, but it is not just valuable to that group of people. It is also incredibly valuable to our ability to support unexpected situations, varied devices, and many other things that we want to support, including with our custom charts. And so, I don't have a great answer that's like, do this and you're done, but I do think this is a very important space to be working in.
I really like the point that you made about how it's not just for folks that have different accessibility needs, but also just also really useful for a general audience. I remember a while back seeing like a visualization of like nuclear proliferation with sonification over top of it, and how impactful that was to me, which might make something both more accessible, but also just something that would speak more clearly to a general audience. But yeah, it's not my part to answer the question. So want to turn over to Jamie, Frank, and Kai, who've also done quite a bit of work building these different chart component libraries in different circumstances. And if you could talk about the experience of trying to add accessibility when people create custom visuals.
Just gonna unmute before I think of anything. Pressure. Yeah, it's tough. I think, as we all kind of talked about, Frank, it sounds like a lot of your work, I think, is also thinking about this a little bit more too. I think I definitely have a good sense of how much work and how challenging it was to build that into just, an accessible bar chart made in D3. There's a ton to think about there. And, I think practically, there's a lot of great utils that came out of that data viz work. So I think, if you're interested in just coming up with a keyboard navigation pattern is a great controller that you could use there. There's some great utils. But yeah, I think just taking a step back, that's the challenge at hand. It's definitely what's interesting to me about, working at the Times, because I think that is a lot of what they do. It's, as I kind of said, it is lots of quickly creating something pretty custom. I think how you get there is probably pretty different depending on what chart it is or what graphic you're creating, how you're creating it. Don't necessarily have an answer there. I think it can be pretty challenging. Yeah. I think there are things you can do though. I guess, well, I'll just say one thing that I did, but just to say, I think I do get in my head too when I'm looking at stuff to, thinking about every single use case on Earth, and, something's better than nothing. And sometimes just adding alt text to the graphic that you're putting out there, there is work that you can do. I think a lot of folks don't know where to begin. There's so much to think about, especially as the way we framed it right now, it's very much like on the designer and the developer to kind of, the tools don't do much for you. And so it can be hard to think about, but, just starting with, just thinking about adding alt text to what you're producing or something like that is just a place to start, and a place to start, learning about, I don't know, what to look out for, what to think about, what to incorporate in the work that you're doing, just practically. But yeah, sorry to cut you off, Kai.
My thought on this is that there are sort of a whole class of visualizations that work pretty well if you just think of them as sort of a representation of a data table. And very frequently with a chart component library, having a really nice accessible sort of data table that underlies all of these visualization types, which can be bar charts, grouped line charts, matrix plots, punch cards. There's many types of visualizations that are basically just a 2D matrix of rows and columns. And then there are some other visualization types which get a little more complex. So there could be these Sankey or flow diagrams, topology diagrams. And these are really different in that they don't just frequently work as well as a 2D table. You want to be able to sort of traverse the links and follow the topology of the graph. And that's a very different thing. Yeah, so that's one sort of concrete thing I can say is, yeah, if you just focus on those table-based ones, it scopes down the problem and it gives you potentially a solution that's somewhat generalizable. Even if you come up with new, slightly different viz types, it may still be a data table that works really well. What I would love to see here is what I think is really missing a lot of the time is we'll get just the bare bones sort of accessibility solution, but what I'd love to see in the future is really improving the ergonomics of exploring this data and having sort of comfortable, pleasant experiences, not just making the data there for you to be able to get at, but engaging to interact with and hear rather than just see. And that's a bigger challenge.
Follow up on that and sort of very explicitly say that, first of all, including data tables when you have them and are able to is a really nice thing to do as a backup, at least, which I think I'm just reiterating what you were saying, Kai, but I just want to make that very explicit. And secondly, I do want to question the premise, which is, as Kai said, there's a lot of really great standard visualizations out there. And so there are times when maybe you should ask yourself, do I need a custom visualization? And maybe you should use one that is off the shelf instead, that is accessible. And that's just a thing to consider as well. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, I love this. This is maybe my favorite kind of question. So I have a few things. One, I have an essay coming out. I contributed to a book. It's coming out in December, I think. So just keep an eye out. I talk about tools. How do you select tools? How do you think about tools for accessibility and visualization? And I even have a very spicy chart where I kind of rate the existing tools out there on a couple axes. So yeah, it's fun. It's a fun piece. So keep your eye out for that. Also, I like to frame the current state of tools. We live in a time where we don't yet have the Phillips screw. And I talk about old fasteners. So fasteners are like these things that get things to stick together, like nails are a type of fastener, but screw fasteners used to be made out of wood and they were custom and they were mostly for wine presses and they're thousands of years old. You'd hand bake them every time you made a press, and no two wood fasteners were the same. They all had a little of that human touch in them. And as a material for building something that scales, can't really do that easily. The Phillips screw transformed industry though, because it took the idea of that kind of swirly shape and it said, can we standardize this in a way that makes this material empower us to do pretty incredible things? We don't really have those base materials yet for expressive, really interesting accessibility stuff, but visualization does. We have grammars of graphics that allow us to do extraordinary things, and accessibility doesn't have the same sort of space to keep up with that. So it's very hard. And my current project is actually in this space, trying to build a tool that can sort of actually do some pretty interesting things, not necessarily trying to keep up with visualization, but just as in its own space. So also keep your eyes peeled, your ears peeled for that too. Yeah.
Are you describing like a viz making tool? When you say tool, is it? Well,
My tool will be something, I call it Data Navigator. So
Okay.
it's specifically actually engaging the problem that Kai was talking about, which is that we have like a lot of data structures that aren't tables and very hard to represent. And how do you like, if you don't have a direct input, like a mouse or sight or direct touch, how do you explore that data space? And I am working on a tool that actually like sort of formalizes movement across data. So directionality, input types, functions, and then also going to demonstrate how you can use that in a lot of different like charting environments to make something that's like an interaction experience that isn't direct input. There's a lot of accessibility reasons for doing that.
Cool.
Yeah.
I'm really excited to see that tool come out. I also really resonate with the argument around using a standard chart versus a custom chart. It being at
So good.
Tableau, I can tell you that a lot of the charts that are made are like bar charts. The bar chart is very powerful, but we still don't have good systems for it. So for folks in the audience, I know we're coming up to the scheduled time. I'm going to ask for about 10 more minutes of your time because we do have a couple more questions that I would like to get to. And we started a little bit late due to some technical issues. So just about 10 more minutes and then we'll wrap up. So there's another question that's come in here, also from an anonymous source that says, a lot of Viz accessibility guidelines assume like a white/light background. However, a lot of mobile apps are starting to provide data visualizations, and many devices now offer this light dark mode. Are there different considerations when you consider this background and I guess this contrast for Viz and accessibility? And what does that mean for charts? Does anybody want to take a first stab at that? I'm going to pick on someone then. I'm going to pick on Kai. Do you have any thoughts of, I know Google has these sorts of things, for a lot of their tooling, and if you've had experience with that and how that has changed your approach to accessible chart design?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Google internally, there is always a desire to get a dark mode up on a lot of our products, especially from contributors on those teams. And it is not the most straightforward thing to do. One consideration, if you have an existing sort of toolkit that you're using, is that there may be just a lot of, this is a very sort of technical thing, there may just be a lot of colors in your templates or the way that these pages are built that it doesn't make it so straightforward to just invert the color scheme. More in terms of color, though, I mean, light is the presence of all colors when you have a white background, and dark is the presence of no color. So it is a different space. There are more colors that are available against a dark background that have sufficient contrast. So there are absolutely different considerations required. I don't feel like I am as an expert in color theory to have really more nuanced opinion than that. I do enjoy working in dark mode, but I feel like I'm still just experimenting around. I enjoy having a more experimental approach. Very frequently, if we have a more experimental prototype, we'll put it on a dark background just to give it that sort of cool look. That's all I have.
Anybody else? Sorry, go ahead, Frank.
So I did something really silly at Visa. I shouldn't say silly. It's very serious. It's sorry, Chris. If you're watching this, it was a good decision. There's kind of two considerations actually for stuff like dark mode, and one of them is limited contrast or low contrast. which often uses a dark mode, and then just a dark mode, which is a darker design space. When it comes to accessibility, a lot of people will activate a dark mode UI from accessibility and have limited colors. That is actually a beast to deal with in data visualization, because you kind of need, I don't know, if you're being pretty strict about it, strip every color out of your visual and provide a single color for the visualization and match the actual scheme of the system being set, a higher level thing you have to inherit into your data visualization and follow those rules. Dark mode, this is what we actually kind of did at Visa. We actually detect, like we try to detect dark mode. So if you're on a PC and you open Edge or IE, rest in peace IE, you can turn on the system's dark mode, and our charts invert color and then rotate hue 180 degrees so that a dark green becomes a light green. I did that. I thought it was kind of clever. It was sort of fun. I don't know, that the question itself is a big space to explore. But yeah, there's some fun things you can do, I think, to kind of make things still delightful and nice. Yeah.
Jen or Jamie, do you have any thoughts?
No, I was staying quiet because I was hoping Frank would bring that up. I love the contrast dark mode. Yeah, nothing new to add. I think New York Times just has a dark mode available now, so certainly something I'm starting to think about as well. But yeah, I think the way we approached it at Visa was one way to think about it. Definitely like kind of revisiting that topic again, post battle, thinking about some new things, and I don't know, some new thoughtful ways to make those colors kind of have the same effect on a dark background. But yeah, nothing to add there really.
Any
Actually,
thoughts, Jen?
Oh,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Frank or Kai.
I do have one thought actually, which is I don't feel like the WCAG contrast ratio, that number that it gives you is good enough for dark mode. I very frequently think that it's not quite the right. It's not really. There are better ways of measuring contrasts against a dark background, and I don't think that the WCAG contrast ratio is really the best. I think it cuts out a lot of colors that are viable and lets some stuff pass that maybe shouldn't pass.
So for those of you getting into this, I fully agree. Highly recommend looking at WCAG 3 and SPCA APCA algorithm. The model we use for color contrast currently in WCAG is very old, and bless the people that chose it. They chose a model that was pretty well established, but it does not do a good job at predicting contrast in certain cases. One of them is dark, especially if dark is the background. So yeah, new algorithms I hope will be much better. They're still going through testing and stuff. It'll be years down the road, but yeah, nothing is stopping you from using them now alongside modern, like current stuff.
Jen, any last thoughts before we move on to the final question? All right. So I'm going to ask the last question of the day. Thank you, everybody, for your great questions and your excellent responses. I have so many thoughts coming up from everything that you guys have just said. But the final question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to add to it a little bit, is bigger organizations have resources to invest in accessibility. But what about smaller organizations? And I'll also add to this, like, what about research groups as well that are not an organization? What can be done to create awareness about the importance of data visualization and accessibility? And I want to add to this something, Frank, that you said is, what are our responsibilities as data visualization developers towards accessibility as well? So big versus small, academic versus non-academic. Any thoughts? And what is our responsibility to promote more accessible solutions? So I'll go through each of you. I'll start with Jen. That's all right.
Sure. Yeah. And this is a really good question, and I think that it's a complicated answer. I'll try not to go on for too long, but I think part of it is cultivating expertise and educating yourself as much as possible about these things. Part of it is, what Frank pointed to a while ago about building it into your workflow so that you don't have to try to come in at the end and fix things when it's costly and maybe even impossible to do so. And it's just so much easier if you do it as you go. And part of it is disability representation. And I think we could have a very long conversation about what we've had a little bit of back and forth about hiring disabled people and some of the risks there, but overall you want to, as much as possible, not, close the door without even considering it to having representation on your team, because you are going to get first person experiences that are different. You also don't want to, burden disabled people with having all of the responsibility for accessibility. And it doesn't all happen only through hiring, but representation is important because you want people there who are going to, intrinsically and deeply care. And that's one of many paths to getting that. So that's where I would start, but I'm really curious to hear everyone else's answers.
Jamie, would you like to go next?
Yeah, sure. I think that was a great answer. And it made me really grateful too that you brought up authoring tools. I think that's something that kind of gets lost in the sauce. We're talking, there's a lot to talk about, obviously, but that's such an important one. Making it easier to make this stuff, but making it easier for everyone to make this stuff and contribute to this work is such a big part of it. Yeah, lots in there, big organizations, small organizations. I think Jen, your point too about kind of taking that work on yourself to learn as much as you can. I think I've heard Sarah Fossheim say in the past, they were asked what one piece of advice you would give to somebody trying to learn this work, and I think they had said just familiarizing yourself using a screen reader. And I thought that was such great advice. If you're thinking about this work, just the work of understanding that you're designing for more than one user, more than one interface, just opens up this world and kind of, I think, starts some gears moving and kind of starts to give you some idea of what direction to move in. But also, I guess I would say find community where you can find folks that are also interested in doing this work. I think as you kind of touched on, Frank, can be easy to burn out. I think as you start to your eyes open to, or you start to realize how much work there is to do and undo and learn and unlearn maybe. Yeah, I think it helps so much to have some folks to kind of chat about this work with, to organize with, to have some back and forth with. And I just encourage everyone to do that, whether that's at work or outside of work, where have you.
Thank you. Frank.
Yeah, I have an answer that I give that businessy people like, but I still think it's a good answer, which is that 26% of people in the United States self-report living with a disability. If we're making visualizations or data stuff for people, at least 26% of our work should be spent considering people. That's just the simple answer, is that whether you're a solo person, a small team, or a big org, about a quarter of your work should at least be in this space. And I actually have done work, this is non-researchy, academic research, but it's industry research in collaborations with a lot of practitioners in this space. Teams that actually do this work and are doing a great job really only spend about 10 to 15% of their work doing it. So actually, if you think of input to output, hey, that's a decent, you're doing pretty good. 10 to 15% of your work spent, but it still covers about a quarter of, people who are traditionally really excluded. That's awesome. And I think that, 1 day a week is also what I say. Just spend a day a week if you can, if you just think in the big term of your project planning. Yeah. Any one person can actually make a huge impact.
That's awesome advice. Kai, I'll give you the last word.
Thank you, Anna. I think it's important, as several people mentioned, to be curious and participate in the community. This is really sort of an evolving set of standards and practices. In terms of also kind of try to give a little corporate answer, since I think this is about organizations, which is if you're at a company or an organization, accessibility, if it's really put into practice, needs to become sort of a repeatable process as you release things. So designing a test or a process that ensures better visibility, that's something that hopefully you can demonstrate some impact, that your product or whatever it is you're building has additional reach, is reaching additional users, is expanding your market. And I think making that connection can be really important to keeping these efforts funded and active at organizations and companies that we're actually expanding our reach by making our product more accessible.
Thank you so much. Thank you everybody for your thoughtful answers. So this panel could probably go on for longer as I have lots of questions and there are definitely more questions as well that have come up that we weren't able to get to at the end. So I'd like to give a virtual clap to all of our participants. Thank you so much for the time that you've spent today. And so this concludes our panel session. We're going to be back for those of you in Oklahoma at noon, roughly about 2 hours after the lunch break, to be starting off our next session about bridging academia, industry, and government. Thank you so much. And thank you once again to our wonderful panelists. Enjoy the rest of your conference.